Hi everybody, and welcome to my Bike Beyond the Pale bike tour. My name is Ben. I'm a Dub, born and bred in Dublin. Lived here most of my life, and I'm also a qualified regional tour guide for the area of Dublin East. And where we are doing our tour today, it's my locality. Would very much love and look forward to someday bringing you on a real bike tour, but for the moment, with the current restrictions in place, just going to do a little bit of an alternative. So I'm going to cycle the tour on my own, but while at the same time, I'll welcome you all to sit back on your sofas or on your chairs, or who knows, maybe even your own stationary bikes at home or wherever you are, and enjoy the tour. Now, why the name Bike Beyond the Pale? Well, some of you may know, or some of you may not know, that the Pale is a region, or it's an historic region really, that dates back probably as far back as the 13th century, when it may have had its origins, but certainly by the late 15th century it had kind of a firm definition, so to speak. And basically, what the Pale is it's a region surrounding, you could probably call it the Greater Dublin area. So it goes beyond the county of Dublin into the county of Leinster, and it was basically established after the Norman invasion, and then later on English settlers arrived, and they tended to settle largely in the Greater Dublin area. And of course, over the centuries, they were subject to many attacks, and there was many battles fought from, if you like, the native or the local population from outside the Pale, and the settlers inside the Pale. So it was decided in the late 15th century to establish a formal boundary as a form of protection, and there were many kind of castles and various fortifications that were built along its border. Now, the name Pale derives from the Latin word palus, meaning a stake, a wooden stake, or a pale, and that is indeed an indication as to how it was constructed, because essentially there's been various descriptions. In some cases there's bits of wall, but essentially it's a ditch, or a double ditch with a mound and these wooden stakes. Now, in reality, it hasn't survived much to this day, and in fact there are suggestions that in many cases it never really existed at all beyond a map, but there are definitely places where it did exist. And the area where we're going to do our bike tour today is known, and it's been documented, that this is an area that the Pale boundary ran through. So where I live is an area today, we call it City West, but it's close to the townland of Saggart. And from Saggart up to the next townland of Rathcoole is essentially where we're going to do this tour today, and that's generally the area where the Pale ran. And the reason for the expression beyond the Pale is that even though this boundary no longer really exists, other than one or two remote locations, it does remain in the lingo. So there is that phrase beyond the Pale, which is still exists in sort of the colloquialisms of today, and basically it means that if you're a person who maybe you're a little bit you do things your own way, maybe, or you're kind of not always appropriate, or kind of, do things in an appropriate way, or you're inappropriate behaviour, you can be described as beyond the Pale. So, okay, without further ado, going to turn around and get going. So, as we leave Brown's Barn behind us, we're going to hit the road. Just a quick word in terms of anyone who's wondering, God, is this guy mad? He's out on the bike, he's out in the open road, and he's chatting away, in terms of safety and all that. Don't worry about it. Don't be concerned. I have my phone in a waterproof case mounted on a mounted on a or fixed onto my handlebar, so I'm completely hands-free. All I'm doing is talking, maybe occasionally listening to the odd question you might have. And the roads, this is probably the busiest section of road. Just going to leave it now shortly. And for the most part, the rest of the tour will be through quiet roads and a bit of parkland and the like. So we should be fine. So I'm just pulling in here for a second. So here we go, Bianconi Avenue, named after our friend Carlo or Charles Bianconi. Okay, so our first road, if you like, or street that we're going to be cycling along is Bianconi Avenue. And just to explain how Brown's Barn got its name, well, first of all, just say that before Bianconi took it over as his depot, it was also a stable. It was called the Royal Garter Stables, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But it became Brown's Barn. It's probably a typically Irish thing, that, you know, folks could neither get their heads nor their tongues around these foreign names. So Bianconi got shortened to Bian, which somehow got morphed into Brown. So that's where you get the Brown's Barn. And indeed, the townland that we're now in, and it's quite a large townland, one of the biggest in Dublin, is called Brown's Barn after it. And another example of the play on names is there's a story that in locally in Clonmel where he, as I said, he carved out his business. Locals refer to him as Brian Cooney. And it so happened that there was a Cooney family that lived just outside the town of Clonmel, and somebody who knew the family was up there visiting one day, and they were chatting away and said, oh, by the way, you must be fierce proud of the young fella down in the town there. And they said, oh, what young fella? And I said, Brian Cooney. So sure, he's nothing to do with us. So even locally there was confusion over the name. So shortly now we're going to come up to a road. We're going to hang a left, come up to the T-junction. We'll be hanging a left, or turning left, and onto Garter Lane, so called after the Royal Garter Stables. So you can imagine back in the day, and we're going back a couple of centuries, 2-3 centuries, as we turn left, and as we're cycling along this road, you know, back in the day, this literally would have been a well-trodden road or laneway, with all the horses toing and froing from the Garter Stables. Because this area, of course, we're now on the road up to Saggart and the lands around it, which incidentally, I think it was around the 13th century thereabouts. These lands were granted to St. Patrick's Cathedral, so anybody who's familiar with Dublin and its history will be familiar with St. Patrick's Cathedral. So its lands stretched right out as far as here, and indeed there is a number of historic monuments and buildings coming up on our right hand side. You'll see the stone wall just coming up. There was a Norman castle here, so it probably would have been quite a, as I say, a well trodden or a busy route passing along here back in the day. And of course, this area also, we're very, very close to the Pale boundary. There are no remnants, at least nothing that's been verified, of the original boundary, but other than to say that it passed through these parts generally. I'm just going to pull in here for a second, and I'm just going to actually I'm going to shoot across here. See this nice gateway, and we'll see the plaque on the stone wall there, stone plaque saying Tasaggart House. Interesting that it's Tasaggart as opposed to Saggart. And there's a reason for that. By the way, I think this is a private entrance into the hotel, which I'll talk about in a minute. Nice arch bridge there, I don't know if you can see that. But yeah, Tasaggart House. So the name Saggart, and we're kind of coming into the townland of Saggart very shortly, probably up around about the next traffic lights, which are a short distance up. So the Irish for Saggart is Teach So there's the clue. So Teach literally means the house of the priest's house, basically. And so, you know, again, that the name Saggart morphed over the years. You know, it was Tasaggart at one point, and then the ta was dropped and it just became Saggart. But the actual, it kind of belies in a way, or doesn't tell the full story of the true origin of the name, which is actually Teach Misacra. Misacra being a saint, or somebody who became a saint, who's established a monastery way back in the 7th century. And we'll chat about that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. But before we get to the village of Saggart, just to mention on the right hand side, I've briefly mentioned the hotel, City West Hotel, which is what these grounds on the right hand side are today. They were the hotel was opened, I think it was early 90s or thereabouts, by Jim Mansfield and the Mansfield family. And an interesting little anecdote was, I can't remember, it might have been about 10-15 years ago, they built a new building, a new kind of annex to the hotel, as a convention centre. But it was without planning permission, and there was quite a big legal toing and froing and squabble at the time. Eventually, they were allowed retain the building, and it got a lot of use. But there's a bit of an ironic twist, because recently in the pandemic, it's been I don't know if commandeered is the right word, but it was given over as a kind of a provision, as a contingency for the an overflow to deal with the pandemic if necessary. And I believe at the moment it either is or is being prepared as a vaccination centre. Now, so that's City West Hotel. You might have just seen this church as we approached. That's Saggart Church. We're going to come back to that in a second and talk about it. We have a cemetery on our right, and we're going to wander down there too. But before we do, I'm just going to keep going on up the hill for a bit towards the village, very historic village, and just point something out before doing a U-turn and coming back down the hill. So, just going to pull in. It's a lovely sunny day, albeit cold. I believe there's a shower on the way, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, as they say. Now, so across the road here we see a pub. You might make out the name, Jacobs. So, owned and run by the Jacobs family, opened in 1901, still operating. I'm not 100% certain whether it's still in the ownership of the Jacobs family or not. I was chatting to somebody yesterday, local in the area, and the Mr. Jacob, or one of the Jacob family, does live nearby, and it's on the to-do list to meet up with him and have a chat. But anyway, the reason I'm pointing it out is because there's a connection between a building that was in this location before it became a pub, and something that it was used for a kind of a macabre connection with the cemetery or the graveyard down in Saggart, just down the way. So we'll talk about that in a second. So just going to turn around while it's nice and quiet. We'll head back down to the church and we'll just talk for a minute about this Fabulous church, uh, and a bit about its history and how it was built, why it was built, when it was built, all that good stuff. So, just actually before we do, I'm going to a shameless plug for my favourite local eatery. My wife and I treat ourselves on occasion. Not obviously now because it's closed because of the restrictions, but hopefully in the not too distant future it'll open again. Lovely little spot called the Anvil, family run. Sisters, I only know them. I don't know their surname. I only know them by their first name. And yeah, really friendly spot. Great food, great ambience. So there's a little plug for the local restaurant cafe. We're actually pointing down towards the cemetery, which we'll come back to in a second. But I'm just going to turn around and kind of looking into the sun here, so I'm hoping that you'll get a good view of the church and the steeple. So this is St Mary's Church, Sagart. The building that we're looking at, the fabulous building we're looking at the moment, was actually built in the 1840s, coming up to the possibly even including the Great Famine years. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But before the church that was there was built, it was there was another church, another Catholic church here that was built in the previous century, in the early 18th century, and it fell into ruin and it was reconstructed in the 1840s, as I say. But there's an interesting story around the original church and how it came to be. So there's a guy, and his name is James O'Toole, and in the year 1710 he heads off to France to study to be a priest. And England, France at war at the time, and he becomes embroiled in that. He ends up on a battlefield somewhere tending to an Englishman by the name of Fitzwilliam. Now, they kind of got chatting, get friendly, and Fitzwilliam turns around to James O'Toole and he says, listen, after you finish, you complete your studies, when you're heading back to Ireland, sure, pop in and, we'll catch up. So, James O'Toole completes his studies, heads back and through England, and remembers the invitation and calls in. And what he didn't know or realise is that this guy Fitzwilliam, he's fairly well connected. In fact, he's friendly with King George the First, no less. So next thing, James, he's granted an audience with King George the First, and the king turns around to him and says, "Listen, is there anything that you'd like me to do for you? Any wish that you might have?" And James turns around and he says, "Well, do you know what? I'd love to be given permission to practice as a priest, Catholic priest, back home in Ireland." Which at the time would have been a big ask, but in fairness, his wish was granted. So it was that James returned to Ireland and sometime later established the first Roman Catholic Church here in Sagart, as I say, in the early 18th century. I have a date of 1730. I think that there's a bit of a gap there, I know, but around about that time anyway. And then, as I say, in the 1840s, the new church was built. The old one had fallen into ruin. And very much a local community effort. Most of the people, probably all of the people working on the construction, were from and of the community, as indeed was a lot of the stone, which would have been quarried locally. Lots and lots and lots of quarries back in the 18th and 19th centuries around this part of the country, around this part of Dublin, South County Dublin, with the foothills. And one of the main benefactors was the MacDonald family, and a fellow called John MacDonald. And they actually will crop up again later on in the tour. We'll come to that a bit later on. So look, that's St Mary's Parish Church, still active, operating today. It's my local church near where I live. So we're going to do a turnaround now. And we're going to head down towards the cemetery. Lovely arch with a cross through it, which I understand is part of the original entrance to the graveyard, which goes back quite a bit. Now, as I was saying earlier, The Sagart gets its name from Saint Massacra, and the church and monastery that he founded back in the 17th century, believed to be somewhere around here. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be any significant remains of it, although some suggestions are that, I don't know if you can see that in the sun, but that little structure up there, part of that may have been part of the original church. But I promised you, if you remember when we went up to Jacob's pub and said that there was a story that's connected with with the graveyard. So the story is back in the 19th centuries, early 19th century, late 18th century. The hideous and ghoulish practice of body snatching was quite common in Ireland. I believe it was common in Scotland as well, and perhaps in other places. But Sagart Cemetery here was no exception. And there was basically the practice was that some of you may well know is the sorry, I'm trying to pick a good spot here just to perch up. So the practice was whereby people had been recently laid to rest, then their bodies or their corpses would be literally just removed from their coffins, from their graves, and completely illegally, and very much a black market activity. They would be sold off to surgeons and colleges of surgeons in particular, so that the surgeons could go about both learning and developing their craft, if you like, for want of a better word, on sort of specimens that were, well, you can't say they were alive, but they were alive not so long ago or previously, and but also to train students. And so it was quite a common practice, and so the community here in Sagart got together, and in the building where Jacob's Pub is now, it was a two-story building then, as it is now. And what they did was any time there was a burial, they had a rota system where somebody would stay in the house on the second floor and kind of keep watch. So it was one evening there had been a burial, and there was a man in the house keeping watch, and perhaps through the whatever light was afforded by the moon and the stars that night, he could just make out three shadowy characters down somewhere around about where I'm standing now, or maybe a little bit further down. And he saw them, and he had a gun, rifle, took aim and shot, and he saw two characters fleeing the scene, and not sure what happened to the third. So when light came, he out of curiosity came down, and he realised then that he had shot dead the third guy, who turned out actually to be a 19-year-old student of the College of Surgeons. So yeah, quite a macabre story there. See, it's still a alive cemetery today. Another story, if I can fit it in, is about a guy who was living alone by himself with his mother. It was just himself and his mother, and his mother passed away, and that night, after she had been laid to rest, he started having this nightmare that his mother was crying out and saying, "Oh, leave me alone, don't take me away, I want to rest here, I'm okay here." And he was quite disturbed, understandably, I suppose. And so much so that the following morning, he when he got up, and he headed down to the grave, only to find out that the body snatchers had taken her away as well. So yeah, so that's Sagart Cemetery, and a couple of stories about body snatching. So heading back up the hill towards the village, we're going to hang a left here now shortly, Um, nice bit of sun poking out. So even though this tour from beginning to end is only in around 6 or 7 kilometres, we'll have passed through 4 townlands. Oh yeah. And so we started out in Brownsbarn. We have come through Saggart, and we'll come back through Saggart, but we're now just entered into one of the smallest townlands, not just in Dublin, but in Ireland, and it's got the odd-sounding name of Muniata. Now, like a lot of, well, most place names in Ireland, about 95% of them, they're all, the English name is a kind of a phonetic transliteration, if you like, of the Irish name. And in this case, Muniata comes from Moin and Yata. Moin meaning turf or bog, and Yata meaning gate. So suggesting that there may have been some sort of a field or a boggy field here. Maybe it had something particular about the gate into it, I don't know. But actually that patch of green that we just passed there, if you look at old maps of the area, you'll see that was known as Muniata Commons. So that might have been the said field. So we're stopped here now. You might just make out a field and a building behind it, in front of us. Normally this gate is closed. Maybe it's because it's the weekend. Or I say normally the gate is open. Maybe because it's the weekend it's closed. Otherwise we'd be able to go in. But hopefully you'll get a reasonable view from here. So this is the local GAA club. So GAA clubs all over the country. Very much the lifeblood of Irish society, I suppose, in many respects. So the building in the distance is the primary school or national school, St Mary's National School. That was open in 2014. I guess you could say it was an expansion of the school that previously existed, which we'll visit a little bit later on. And the pitch in front of us there, Gaelic football and hurling will be played there. And just you see the clubhouse there, Naomh Mhuire Teach Sagart. So the club was founded in 1906, but going back as far as 1760, there's records of a hurling match that took place here, and it consisted of 2 teams consisting of players from 3 parishes in each team. So you had the parish of Lyon, Kilteal and Newcastle on one side, and then the parishes of Talla, Rathcoole and Saggart on the other side. And it must have been quite the festive occasion, because something like 30 gallons of whiskey, several gallons of ale, pork, red and salted herring and cheese were among the items on the fair that day. So and then, as I say, 1906 the club was founded. In terms of success, probably some success of the club in the early years. 1921 won the Club All-Ireland, and then in 1942 the Dublin football team that won the All-Ireland Senior Football Championship that year had 5 players on its team from this club, St Mary's. So that's a little bit about St Mary's GAA club and the school. As I pop my phone back into its little stand on the handlebar. So I'm going to just turn back around again, and back out the way we came. Retrace our pedals, our wheels, as opposed to our steps, and we'll head around back out onto the main road and up the hill to the original or the earlier schools, and have a look at them and have a bit of a chat about them. There's rain forecast today at some point. I'm hoping that the forecast is wrong, because it's even though it's bitterly cold, it's lovely and sunny, and actually there is a little bit of heat in the sun, so we'll enjoy that while we can. So we sweep round to the left here. Yeah, so speaking of townlands, I mean, there's many townlands in Ireland. In fact, there's over 60,000 townlands in Ireland. Actually, it's probably, in terms of place names, I believe that Ireland has the densest concentration of place names of any country in the world. More place names per area. So we've got provinces, counties, baronies, civil parishes, and then townlands. Now, just going to hang a left here, and so this is one of the old schools. You can see now it's quite derelict, the old school yard there, and now I have seen a planning notice saying that this is at least there's an intention to develop this as a community centre, and I can only assume because of the current restrictions that everything's kind of on hold, but hopefully all things permitting there will come a time where that can and will go ahead. So this is not the original St Mary's School, but this building was opened around about 1949, and this was the main national school from then until 2014, when the current school was opened. You see there's quite a long building, and just going to, you might see here the little plaque on the wall, you might just make out, so the old Irish writing on top inscribed or etched into the stone plaque there, Skull, Nave, Wither, it says, and then underneath the English translation, St Mary's National School. The old door here, and here we have another little plaque on the wall, Buchaley on top, and then in English, Boys down below, suggesting that the school was obviously divided into two parts, as would have been customary at the time. I mean, we still have, national schools. I think most of them are girls and boys mixed these days, but there are some that remain separate. But those days you had the same building, but the girls and the boys were separated. And just come around the corner here, we'll probably see, here we have it, a door. It's just a single door here, and we have the plaque saying Colony for girls. So obviously girls on one side, boys on the other. Now over there you'll see a building with this kind of round porthole windows, and behind that building, which we'll come to in a second, is where the original national school was, which dates right back to 1881, when it was formally opened as a national school, or established as a national school. But actually, if you look at older maps, you'll see there was a school there right back as far as the 1830s at least. So so there's been a school here in Fagart of some description for quite some time, over the years, decades, centuries indeed. Okay, I'll pop the phone back there. I'm going to head back up onto the bike, turn around, and just while we're heading up to the old school, or the original school, a little anecdote. When the original school was opened, there was a male teacher who taught the boys and a female teacher who taught the girls, and they not only taught in the school, but they also lived in the same building. So there was a kind of an upstairs where they had their quarters where they lived, and then downstairs is where they taught their classes. But the male teacher had, I think it was 96 boys or 90 something boys that he taught, and he had a salary of £8. And the woman teacher, she only had 60, I think it was 64 or 60 something girl students, and her salary was £6. Now, the reason for that pay differential, was it numbers based or gender based? I guess the answer to that will be consigned to history. But anyway, here it is. That's the old the original national school, as I say, established in 1881, but a school marked in this location on old maps. I'm talking about the old 6 inch to 1 mile OS series map does show a school here, and that would have been as far back as the 1830s or 1840s anyway, as I said. Okay, so that's St Mary's GAA Club in Saggart, the local GAA club, and the school, the present school and its two previous incarnations. Just incidentally, looking up the hill here, we're not going to head up there. That's kind of beyond the bounds for this tour, but that's the next townland called Boherboy, from the Irish Boherboy, Yellow Road. And actually, if we look just around to the left here briefly, we'll see there's a little pathway here and a housing estate. I'll just slip my camera out so you can see a bit better. So you've got a kind of line of trees along here, and again, if you look at the old maps, you'll actually see that that's pretty much aligned with the old boundary between Muniata townland and Boherboy townland, or the next townland up. And so, people might wonder, the townland boundaries, do they still exist, or are they still relevant? Well, certainly, whatever about rural parts of the country where the boundaries may exist and maybe townlands are referred to a little bit more often, certainly in the urban and suburban districts like this, are really, really historic. I mean, occasionally, address algorithms might throw up a townland. I, for example, live in a townland called Gibbons, and sometimes if I'm logging onto a system or whatever, and it'll pop up automatically. But by and large, they're pretty much historic. So it's kind of nice to be able to refer to them and maybe occasionally pick out the odd boundary like we have just done there. So just coming down through a residential area, all these apartments and townhouses, all fairly recently constructed, I'd say, in the last sort of 10, 15 years, 10 years even, I'd say. And actually, the last population census of Ireland took place in 2016. They take place every 5 years. There's one due this year, but because of the restrictions, it doesn't look like it's going to go ahead. It might have to be postponed. But according to the last census in 2016, Saggart was the fastest growing town by population in Ireland, and it had increased by 50% since 2011. And I guess, I suppose all of these residential units are, I guess, indicative of that. So we're back out onto the main road. The village is down to our right hand side, so we've kind of skirted around the village. And you might just have a quick look there. Drury Mills is the name of this new housing estate, and that is a clue as to what our next stop is going to be, our place of interest, historic interest, because there's a link with that name. And nice wee cycle lane here. The dash line, for those interested in cycling, means it's an advisory lane, as opposed to a mandatory lane, which would be denoted by a continuous line. So the dash line basically means that cars or motorised traffic are allowed to enter it if they need to. Now, whether they're allowed parked there or not is another matter. But anyway, we can leave that discussion for another day. So up ahead of us here is, just going to point out, to get close enough to it. I don't get too close because the areas were peering in somebody's window, but just, if you can't make out what it says, the street name there in Irish reads Ryark Ross, and Llewellyn in English Millrace View. And again, just another little clue as to what we're approaching. So we had Drury Mills, we've just come through, and now we have an estate, and all of the roads in this estate are Millrace something. So Millrace View, as you just saw there, And the reason being, you might just get a shot of it there, but don't worry, we'll get a better view of it later on in about a minute or so. Is the what's known as the Saggart paper mill. So we'll come around to it now in a second, but the Drury family took ownership of it sometime in the mid 19th century, and so hence the historic association there, with Drury Mills being the name of that estate that we came through. But Saggart paper mill. So just go back to the 18th century was when the Saggart paper mill was originally established, and at that time, even before that time, water mills producing lots of different produce, from corn to paper to all sorts of things, were very, very common around these parts especially. I mean, so many rivers flowing through South County Dublin, the Dodder, the Cammock, which is where we are now, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the Saggart paper mill, which is what we're looking at now, you can see the chimney and the outhouse, and it was established right back in around about 1760, and was actually fully operational until relatively recently, about 50 years ago, in around 1970 or so, was when it finally closed down. And it was, as you say, there was lots and lots of mills in this area, but this paper mill was often regarded as, at the time by many, as producing the finest quality paper of any of the paper mills in this area. Some attributed the fact that the quality of the water in the river from which it took its, the water that it fed it from the River Cammock. The name Swiftbrook, as I touched on earlier on, St. Patrick's Cathedral, anybody who's familiar with the history of that would associate it with, or would have heard of its famous dean, Jonathan Swift. And yes, it is indeed, that is the connection, because as I said, these lands would have been part of St. Patrick's Cathedral. So the name Swiftbrook, refers to the Dean Jonathan Swift. So that's where it gets its name. The community got together about 2014, or about 7 years ago now, and they campaigned for the preservation of this monument successfully. As you can see, it's still here. In fact, the steel bands that you see around the chimney, I'm not too sure, to be honest, if they were put in as part of that conservation, but somebody put them in at some point to help to stabilise. You can see there it's leaning quite a bit, but presumably it's stable. But yeah, famous for its quality of the paper that it produced. Indeed, the Bank of Ireland, when it first started printing paper notes, the paper came from this mill. And the other claim to fame is that much later on, the 1916 proclamation, the paper that it was printed on was also produced here. I'm just going to turn around sort of 90 degrees to the left. I see this tall building, or tall, 3-storey building, long 3-storey building. So that was known as the Rag House. Actually, tell you what we'll do, we'll just mosey over a little bit closer to it so we get a better look. So this was known as the Rag House. So this is thankfully also intact. I believe it's used, part of it anyway, I think is used as some form of residence today. But so the ground floor there, basically the way it operated, there were two sort of raw materials that were essential for the paper mill production, or the paper production. It's very simply water and rags, and the rags were transported daily from as far away as Belfast, and they were delivered here. So the ground floor was where basically all the rags that had been collected were dumped. The second floor then was where they were kind of it was kind of like a sorting area, sorting out maybe the usable rags from the unusable, and there was a bit of cleaning going on, I suppose, as well. And then the third floor was where all the good rags that were to be used in the production of the paper were kind of separated out and kept. And then what we're going to do now is we're just going to go up the hill here, up this path, because I mentioned about the conservation. So in the 19th century, mid-19th century, another mill was constructed called the Upper Mill, but sadly that is no more. It did give way to construction of residences, residential area. So, but at least we have the original lower mill is kept. And just on our left here, we'll see a little wheel on the wall there. Now, that wheel actually, there was actually a kind of a train or kind of like a tram track that linked the upper and the lower mills, and that water mill or that wheel there operated that little train or tram that passed between the two mills. I mentioned as well John MacDonald and the MacDonald family as being the main benefactor earlier for the construction of Sacred Church. So it was indeed the MacDonald family who basically established the paper mill here right way back in the 18th century. And quite an astute initiative, I suppose. An innovation by John MacDonald. He lived in a townland called Glenarooneen, which is about, 5 or 6 kilometres southeast of here. And in a neighbouring townland called Farrell there was a river called the River Lachine that flowed into the Blessington Lakes. And he had this idea that to construct a sluice, if you like, a kind of a controlled diversion, and then construct a culvert that became known as a mill race, that basically diverted some of the water from the Lachine River into a lake, which is the Bridis Lake. Now, the Bridis Lake already had the Bridis River flowing into it, so basically just increased the volume of water flowing into that lake. And then at the other end of the lake, coming out, you had a river. At that point, more commonly known or referred to as the Slade River, flowing down to the Slade River Valley, and eventually becoming the Cammock River, which is kind of where we are now. And what we're looking at here now is the old mill pond, which takes its feed from the Cammock River. So that was literally the brainchild of John MacDonald, and that was kind of a key to the establishment of the of his mill here. So getting that extra flow of water from the River Cammock. Incidentally, the River Cammock, some of you may know, is one of the many rivers that flows through Dublin, and quite a significant river. It flows from here, it goes through Kirk Park, Clondalkin. There's actually a valley called the Cammock River Valley near Inchicore. Passes on through Inchicore by Kilmainham and comes into the River Liffey near Houston Station. So we see it here. Look, kids playing away there down by the river. Probably more call it a stream or a brook at this stage, but this is indeed the early stages of the Cammock River. So we're going to head down. We're down through this nice little path through the park, and incidentally, just to divert for a second from all the history, well, maybe just talk maybe more recent history. There's a park coming up here called Rathcoole Park, which we'll come into shortly, and my wife and I, we often come on our daily walks. Often we come here, and we were here one day a few weeks ago, and there was two guys up by the riverbank, but one of them was doing something. It looked like he was kind of making something with bits of branches or something, and just out of curiosity we kind of stopped, and he looked at us and invited us to guess what he was doing. So we were kind of, and it was coming up to St. Bridget's Day, so our first thought was, well, maybe it's a kind of a Bridget's cross, but it didn't look like that's what he was making. So then we looked like more of a kind of a basket or something. And then he said, I'll keep guessing. So eventually one of us chose, so is it a bin? And he says, yes, you're right. So just a bit of, nothingness really. But we did kind of come away, kind of scratching the back of our heads, going, "Why is there a guy standing by the riverbank making a bin out of branches?" And then the kind of thought went out of our heads until we came back a few days later, and we were just walking by here, and yeah, we got our answer. So I don't know if he was kind of working for the local council or what, but it didn't seem like that. It seemed like he was just an individual, just I don't know, doing his own thing maybe. But I'd say fair play. Dogs there swimming in the river. Okay, so that's we're leaving now Saggart Paper Mill and winding our way down through various sections and little offshoots and tributaries of the River Cammock. And we're now coming into Rathcoole Park, which is a lovely park, great amenity. In fact, this section here that I'm on now is this is newly opened. In fact, you can probably see from all of the the fencing around here that there's still kind of works that are ongoing. But this section of tarmac has been opened recently, so and it's lovely. It's really nice. Rathcoole GA pitch there. We just passed there on the right hand side, and as we swing around to the left, we're soon going to come into the village of Rathcoole. In fact, we're probably now in the townland of Rathcoole, and we've got the Dublin foothills, namely Coolmine and Slieve Tool, or otherwise known as Saggart Hill, on our left hand side. I'll just stop for a second in a minute and turn around so that you can see them. So yeah, great. I mean, a very popular park here. Lots of people out, even though it's a really cold day. Yeah, so just do a quick turn around here so you can see. So that's Coolmine Hill in the distance, and over to the left there is Verschoyle Hill. Incidentally, Verschoyle Hill, the name Verschoyle, I forgot to mention it earlier when we were passing the City West Hotel. One of the to Saggart House actually that we passed, that used to be the residence of the Verschoyle family. So, wealthy family who were granted lands there, and that's where they lived. And Verschoyle is quite a I suppose it's a name that is has left its legacy. There's lots of street names. In fact, where I live in Verschoyle Crescent, so all the streets and roads near where I lived is Verschoyle something. So we're now just going to leave Rathcoole Park, skirt to a housing estate, and come out onto the main road and head through Rathcoole village. I suppose just to get back to the subject of the Pale, like as I say, the boundary, appears not to, there doesn't seem to appear of any verifiable remnants of the boundary, the Pale boundary, around these parts, but other than to say that it definitely passed through or close to these areas. And I suppose it's the nature of any kind of geographical boundary anywhere in the world, any time through history. I guess maybe not always, but it's often the case that they've historically been places of much conflict, battles, etc. I guess, just by their nature, you've got people on opposing sides, opposing communities, opposing parishes, etc. And the areas around Saggart and Rathcoole are no exception. In particularly particularly Rathcoole has been the scene of many a skirmish and battle in the past, and we'll touch on some of that in a few moments, just to get a flavour. So, just heading down the hill now, and Just going to hang a left. So this is the main road uh, through Rathcoole village, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I'm just going to pull up here now on the left hand side. There's this interesting looking house. One of those houses, first thing you'll notice is that there doesn't seem to be a front door, and the reason is because the front door is around the back. This is actually Rathcoole House, and today you can see it's private residence, but there's an interesting history to it. The building we're looking at now was built in around 1860 or so, or built onto. The original building dates back to right back to the mid 18th century, and it's one of its famous inhabitants were the Clinch family. And in 1798, famous for the rebellion of 1798, and the village of Rathcoole was, definitely somewhere where, battles did take place in relation to that. Quite a lot of people from this, or a number of people from this area were involved in the 1798 rebellion. And indeed, the parish priest here was a fellow at the time, was a guy called Father James Harold, of the Harold family, quite a famous family. Anyone who's familiar with Dublin might know of the district Harold's Cross. So Harold's Cross comes from the same family, and he was the parish priest here. And famously or infamously, he was saying mass one day, and he addressed his congregation, and he was, some reports indicate, quite mildly critical of the yeomen, who were basically men who would, I guess, very much kind of working on the side of the Crown forces, as kind of like informants, telling the Crown forces of, movements, etc., of the insurgents. Anyway, he was critical of them, and word got out that he had been critical of them, and before he knew it, he became a wanted man, and he went into hiding, and he had various safe houses around the general area, and this was one of them. And there was a little closet inside in the house that became known as the priest's closet, because that's basically where he hid. And he only ever came out to say mass. And one day when he did come out to say mass, and it was right across the road here where you see these houses now, and on his way back he was spotted and he was followed, and soldiers came knocking on the door, and the priest kind of felt look, the game was up here, so he kind of turned himself in. But the father, or the man at the house, Patrick Clinch, who was an elderly man and not in great health at the time, he was about to be arrested when his youngest son, 18-year-old John Clinch, sort of came forward, and he said, listen, nothing to do with my dad, it's all to do with me, so if you're going to arrest anybody, arrest me. Whereupon they duly did, and poor old John Clinch, 18 years old, was marched off, and he was held in Newgate Prison along with Lord Edward Fitzgerald, another luminary of the 1798 rebellion, and he was executed and hanged in Newgate Prison only days later. As regards the priest, James Harold, he was he did not meet the same fate, but he was to be transported to Australia, and indeed, but before that actually happened, he was well connected family, so there was he was able to get that decision overturned legally, but by that stage it was too late, because he was already on the ship, and the captain of the ship said, listen, no jurisdiction here, he's on the ship, we're off. And so it was, he was transported off to Botany Bay in Australia, where he was held for 12 years and then released and after a further 3 years returned to Ireland and ended up in, I think it was Coolock or Clontarf, I can't remember. Anyway, he was a curate there. Later on he founded the church in Fairview on the north side of Dublin, and then later on became parish priest out in Kilcullen in County Kildare. So that's just, a very historic house. It's called Rathcoole House, by the way, so quite a bit of history attached to it. So just up here on the left hand side coming up is another old church. So this is the Church of Ireland church, and this was established in again we're going back to the 18th century as still a live church, or an operational church today. Just get a view of it there through the gate, which is closed, and then we have the graveyard or the cemetery next to it, and a lot of famous families. You might see that little kind of small structure in the background there, which is the where the Kennedy family is. That's there, kind of where they're being laid to rest. A famous family associated with this area back in the day. But I just want to draw your attention to a little stone plaque on the wall here. You can just make it out there, and it says 1798, within this churchyard lie the mortal remains of Richard Fyans and J. Malloy, who were executed near here on the 20th of June 1798. So who were Richard Fyans and J. Malloy, and what terrible deed did they commit that brought about the fate that befell them? Well, first of all, on the left hand side here is the Garda station Rathcoole, which was a police station also back in those times, and indeed apparently this is the spot where the two men were actually executed by hanging. And so who were they? Well, Richard Fyans, from the well-known Fyans family, he owned and ran a bakery just down the road here, and we'll see it. We'll shortly come up to a house which is at the same location of where the bakery was back in 1798, when a regiment were passing through the town and or the village, and they stopped off at the bakery and ordered some freshly hot baked bread and some buttermilk. And shortly afterwards, a lot of the soldiers fell ill. So the captain of the regiment was convinced that they had been deliberately poisoned. And so Richard Fyans, who was working in the bakery at the time, along with his apprentice, John Malloy, were taken away and tried and convicted and executed back up there at the police station. And if we just look, I'm just going to pull in here now for a second. If we just look across the road here. So this house across the road, this is where the bakery was. So we're coming towards the end of the tour. We've got our last stop coming up, or well, our last two stops coming up. But just to mention, so this road is up until the 1960s, when what was then known as the Naas dual carriageway and now known as the N7, which becomes the M7. But up until the 60s, this was actually the main road out of, between that connected Dublin with the south of Ireland, basically Munster and the southwest. So it would have been a very, very busy route. And in fact, if you can imagine, because travelling long distances in those days would have been, these days it's 2-3 hours to pretty much get to between any of the main cities of Ireland. But in those days, it would have been maybe more like 2 or 3 days. So it would have been customary to have stop-offs. Public houses or even inns where people would sort of stay overnight. And so if you look just to our left here, you'll see that we've got a pub here, and you might just make out, I don't know if you can see that, just hold up the camera there. So the oldest original 2-story thatched pub in Ireland, established in 1734. So I'll take that for its word, that it is, that claim is true and valid. But certainly it is true that it was licensed around about 1785, and there definitely was a pub operating here from about that date. And it is kind of nice to see that you don't see the thatched roof too often these days. Certainly not in kind of urban or suburban areas like we are in today. So kind of nice to see that. So that's Rathcoole Inn, by the way. And hopefully in the not too distant future we'll see it and lots of places like it being able to open up again. So we're now at our final stop of the day, and we're here now at you see that, angle the camera up, so the Court of Petty Sessions in Rathcoole. So and you'll see the date over the door there, 1914. So today this is a community library, but kind of nice the way they've kept the original name, or an older name of this building and its purpose. So the Court of Petty Sessions, they were kind of like a forerunner to what we now know as district courts. And but before this was established as a court, a petty Court of Petty Sessions in 1914, this was actually the priest's house. So Father James Harrell, that we spoke about earlier on, this would have been his residence before he went into hiding. And the last person that we might mention here is a character called Felix Rourke, who was from this area. He was born in 1765. And he partook in the 1798 rebellion, but also in in Robert Emmet's 1803 insurrection, which largely took place around Thomas Street, near the centre of Dublin. And he was convicted of murdering somebody, and he was tried. And apparently, there's various accounts. He was certainly executed by hanging. Bit of dispute or debate as to exactly where, but one version of events say that this was the spot where he was actually executed. That's the Bike Beyond the Pale bike tour. I hope you enjoyed it, and as I say, hopefully someday we'll be able to do it for real. But in the meantime, we'll call it a day at that, and hope to see you again someday soon in the flesh.